I want to talk to you this morning about the social and political context of first century Palestine at the time when Jesus was conducting his ministry, when he came into the world and when he spoke to the disciples and many hundreds and thousands of people about his vision and God's purposes for the world. The most important thing to remember is that the Middle East at that time was the centre of a huge amount of trade, and particularly Palestine, with its north-south axis, had lots and lots of trade routes going up and down, and lots and lots of trade from the spice routes and down to Egypt, particularly. So the world was a very different, mixed up kind of place with lots of different races and social groups and tribal groups all intermixing. So it's very hard to say what one group populated that area. And in fact, in history, we might look at various groups having a predominance. So prior to the era of the Bible, where there were people who lived in Canaan and the Philistines and the Phoenicians, all lived in that part of the world and it laid claim to it. And then along came the followers of Abraham, the Hebrews, and it was given to them, they believe, by God for them to populate and then to thrive in that particular place. By the time of Jesus, that area had undergone huge changes, and so therefore there had been various invasions, first by the Assyrians, who were coming from the Middle East, further to the east, then the Babylonians, modern-day Iraq, then the Greeks, and then finally the Romans. So at the time of Jesus, there was a very strong Greek culture in existence in first century Palestine, but also the government was provided by Rome. The characteristics of the Roman government were that they really didn't mind what you did, provided that you offered allegiance to the emperor and that you paid tax. Those two things were very, very important. Now, the first of those was problematic because it was the belief of the Jewish people in that area that there was one God and that his name was, well, unnamed, but that the emperor definitely wasn't God. That was for sure, because he had been self-proclaimed. So in the time of Jesus, Augustus was emperor, and he had declared himself to be God and was treated by the Romans as a god. But the Jewish people found that absolutely blasphemous. They were not prepared to accept that at all. And so therefore, there was quite a bit of tension in the community. The other thing was that the community was ruled by a number of political figures that had been put in place by the Romans, and so therefore their authority was suspect, their legitimacy was suspect. And people like King Herod was put in place by the Romans. He came from a very powerful local family, and his relatives governed in different parts of first century Palestine, some well, some not so well. But generally speaking, he was seen as not a good thing by the Jewish leadership and was under a lot of pressure from the Roman government to keep a lid on things and to maintain law and order, because obviously the Jewish population was the dominant population at the time from a religious perspective. This meant that people like Herod were under a lot of pressure to not upset the apple cart, to keep things under control, and to enable the Romans to extract as much tax as they possibly could. This money went to Rome in the form of an obligation, a monetary obligation from the region. It made Rome very rich, but a lot of that money was taken out of the local economy, and so therefore again there was a source of huge frustration. So, for example, the figure of St. Matthew in the Gospel of the same name, and one of the disciples of Jesus, was a tax collector. The way that he did his business was he basically bought the contract, a franchise, to collect tax in a particular region, and then he extorted money from people in the form of taxes, some legitimate, some not so legitimate, and then he paid what he owed to the government, and he kept the difference. And there was a widespread view at the time that people like Matthew were up to no good and that were doing the wrong thing. They were also funding an empire across the ocean and not keeping the money for themselves. And so it was all seen as a very bad thing. The other big influence in first century Palestine was that of religion. It was to be religious was not a choice. You were either religious or you were an outcast from society. And generally, to work, you had to be a member of a guild, and in order to be a member of a guild, you had to offer um, religious allegiance to the guild gods or religions. And again, this was part of the problem for the Jews and became a significant issue later on for the Christians who couldn't function without offering food to idols because they felt that was blasphemous, but at the same time, in not doing so, prevented themselves from actually working. So the other element that's really, really important are the social structures. Women were considered in the main to be chattels of men. They had no social standing apart from their relationship with their husband. Though it is also true that in some parts of the Roman Empire, some women were incredibly powerful and had a thriving life as merchants and traders in their own right, often inheriting businesses from their husbands. But it was the responsibility of men basically to look after women and for their families to provide a dowry for women to enter into the husband's household in order for him to look after her for the rest of her life. So therefore, marital breakdown was a significant issue, and if marriages broke down, and this is again a theme in Jesus' teaching, if marriages broke down, then actually it created a difficult situation for society because you would effectively have a woman with no means of support, and so therefore the community would have to support her. So the idea of divorce and separation was generally considered to be a really bad idea for that reason, if no other. But also because it brought an element of shame onto a family, because most marriages were to some degree arranged, and so therefore it brought honour to the family if you could marry into a good family, but at the same time it bring terrible shame onto a family if the marriage broke down. So there was a huge response and responsibility to making sure that your marriage was successful. Children were interesting because children didn't really count because the infant mortality rate was fairly high. Then actually, although they were acknowledged and offered to God on the 8th day, and boys were circumcised as an offering to God, in the main, children were not considered to be hugely important until they were aged about 7 or 8, at which case they became real people, effectively, which seems strange to us now. And then, of course, by the time a young girl was 12 or 13 or 14, she would be betrothed, which is not the same as being married, but she would be promised to a man, often many years older than her. This is still the case. Another important part of society was the lack of any writing. The skill of writing and reading was restricted to a very few people. There were lots of languages around, and most of them did have some form of written version. But actually, to be able to read and to write was a skill that not everybody needed. It was a very visual society, so pictures were very important. But actually, it was a profession that you could undertake. And so a scribe, for example, was a very important person in a society because they would read and they would be able to write as well. Very important information was conveyed through writing in order to make sure that things were conveyed accurately. But the cost of papyrus was often prohibitive, and so therefore would have been used very, very sparingly. Paper didn't exist at this time. This was an invention in China which hadn't made its way across the spice routes at this point. And there was still the possibility, certainly in some societies, Egypt being most notable amongst them, where information was put onto clay, which was then baked into the sun, and there were therefore long-term records kept. So, of course, to write something down was a very big deal. So most history was oral. Most stories were recounted from person to person, and therefore they had two really, really important characteristics. First of all, the stories were very simple. And secondly, they often used concepts and ideas that had been rehashed or reused from other areas. And this was really, really important. So in the Bible, if you read the stories about the feeding of the 5,000, or you have stories about pearls beyond price or coins and so on and so forth. These are very easy stories to remember, and you can, generally speaking, remember most of the key points of the story. But actually, there's quite a lot of stories in the Bible from its beginning which are borrowed from other cultures because they seem like a really good idea. And there's a lot of the Old Testament is like that, where some of the stories are put into a very sort of Jewish and Christian context, but actually have their roots far further back in history. The story of the incarnation is an interesting one. The idea of God becoming in some way human is very common, and the Greeks did this all of the time. And so again, these ideas not only would suggest that that was a way that God did things, but also that if you talk about incarnation in that particular context, people would really understand what you were talking about. They would understand that that was how God did the business of gods, and that was perfectly normal. And in that Greek culture that was so prevalent in first century Palestine, where Zeus, for example, had various incarnations as swans and other animals, then that would be the sort of thing that God would do as a matter of course. We, of course, in our post-Enlightenment and scientifically based society would say, well, of course that's absurd. Why would you do anything like that? And we have to fight to justify these stories. But in the context of the time, perfectly normal. Everyone would have said, yep, absolutely, I get that. That's just how God does his business. And so healing ministries, healing miracles, and, for example, feeding. Feeding of the 5,000 isn't in and of itself a miracle because Jesus was able to conjure up so much food. But it was a story about superabundance. It was about the feeding of the 5,000. 5,000 people was a huge number. To have 5,000 people in the same place was ridiculous. It's like going to a modern day, Taylor Swift concert, where there are so many people there. It's a huge number. It's absurdly large. And so it's really important to recognise there's meaning behind the meanings as well. And this is the shorthand for telling these particular stories. So these stories would be very, very familiar to people, and they would be used in different contexts, and then you would bring them into a Christian and Jewish context, and you would be able to say, that's why that all makes sense. The idea of writing things down, as I said just briefly, was really expensive. To actually write things down, things needed to be very, very important, and they needed to be preserved deliberately forever. Now, one of the interesting things about the Gospels and about Paul's writings in the Bible is that these books were written down, but they're based very much on oral histories, and they're very much based on the stories that would have been told one to the other by various apostles, disciples, by Jesus himself. The Gospels are principally the Gospel of Mark is a version of a story that possibly owes a lot to a narrative history based around the ministry of St. Peter, who was a contemporary of Jesus, obviously. And then Matthew and Luke are based on that source of Mark, but also with some other oral histories which were combined together. So the sayings of Jesus in those two bigger Gospels, Matthew and Luke, are based on another writing now lost to us, which included a lot of the words, the things that Jesus said. But to have written any of that down meant that the society was prepared to invest a huge amount of resource, money, time, in order to preserve those writings and to be able to get the exact meanings of things rather than the more generic stories. Paul's letters also very, very important for that same reason. The investment in time of actually writing something down, of copying it and then sending it around to various communities and preserving it for, in this particular case, many hundreds and thousands of years. suggests it's really important. And it also suggests that there was a growing view in the Jesus movement that actually things needed to be written down because the last days were not imminent, or if they were, it wouldn't matter, they wouldn't have wasted the effort. But actually, so many people who were contemporaries of Jesus were beginning to die, and their knowledge was being lost. And so therefore there was this huge emphasis on writing things down and memorializing and memorizing all of the words of Jesus. One of the other characteristics, of course, in the writing often you find is poetry or hymns. And if you have a good look at the Bible, certainly the New Testament, you will see lots of information that has been in its original Greek or then translated into Latin and English, maintains a very rhythmic, melodic kind of feel of prayers and perhaps some elements of worship that were included. So that's really, really important. So just to sum up, first century Palestine would have been a fascinating place to live. It would have been politically quite exciting. It was religiously diverse, socially amazing, all sorts of people living in the same area. And it had been an area which had been populated and repopulated over eons by various governments and kingdoms which had sought to put their stamp on it. The modern day Israel, which is essentially the state we're looking at, which it would be, if you ever visit, is clearly made up of a huge number of social and political and cultural influences, which all fight for a voice in that region. So it's important to put our mind back into the context of first century Palestine to see what was going on and what people meant. If we only look at the Bible and the stories of Jesus through a modern lens of post-Enlightenment scientific rationalism, we will miss a huge amount of the significance of the stories, and that would be a great loss. So I encourage you to embrace and enjoy the material and to immerse yourself in first century Palestine.